Welcome to another edition of Disability and You. I am Ganesh Singh and I'll be with you for approximately 30 minutes. On this edition, I will be having a discussion with three passionate advocates from the Guyana Disability Movement. Our focus will be on access to employment and access to the built environment for persons with disabilities. We are observing another International Day for Persons with Disabilities. And in Guyana, we've formulated a week of activities, and this has been going on for the past 11 years. Through these activities, we've been able to advocate for structural changes at different levels to ensure that persons with disabilities are able to access their rights as outlined in the Guyana Persons with Disabilities Act and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have seen some progress as it relates to provision of services for persons with disabilities and removal of some of the barriers that hinders their development. However, we are still a far way from where we would like to be as it relates to full independence for persons with disabilities. Hence, our discussion on employment and accessibility. You will hear from Asif Khan, Holly-Ann Maxihong, and Rosemary Ramit. They will share their experiences as persons with disabilities trying to access the built environment and also working as a person with a disability or trying to get a job as someone with a disability here in Guyana. So without any further elaborations, I'll move to Asif, Holly, and Rosemary. Welcome to another program of Disability and You, because you guys are no strangers to the program.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Ganesh.
Thank you for
again.
having us here.
Thank you for having us.
As I said, our focus is on accessibility and mainly access to the built environment. Holly-Ann, you're a wheelchair user, so we'll start with you. What are some of the current barriers you encounter trying to access public buildings, trying to access even our roadways as someone living with a disability, a physical disability?
Again, Ganesh, thank you for having me on the program, and happy Disability Week to all of my fellow PWDs. One of my biggest challenges that I have accessing infrastructure, just being able to access buildings. Most buildings have stairs and no ramps. So most wheelchair users are normally left without the avenues to do everyday things. We are not able to go out with our friends. We're not able to go shopping. Even the roadways is not safe for us because we don't have designated paths on the road. So we are competing with the traffic on a daily basis, and it is not safe for us because
Definitely not.
accidents can and have occurred in the past. We are dealing with the lack of accessible parking for us. Even if we do get a chance to go out, we don't have parking to allow us to safely transfer from our vehicles to our wheelchairs or mobility devices. So again, we are left to fend for ourselves on the roadways, and to sometimes, we get into confrontation with persons because they don't understand that we need that extra time to be able to safely maneuver ourselves from one place to the next. We are focused, it's all well and good for us to talk about employment, education, but most of us, we are faced with the challenge of, even if we apply for a position and we are successful, we would not be able to take it up because most buildings are not wheelchair accessible. There are no ramps, there are no elevators, so we are still cut off from accessing the basic features around town or in Guyana.
Very interesting. And the way you put it is, showing the relation between employment and accessibility, education and accessibility, because accessibility is intersecting across the different areas. Rosemary, as someone living with a visual impairment, what are some of the challenges you encounter in trying to navigate the built environment, whether it's internally in public buildings or externally with our roadways and sidewalks?
All right. For someone who uses a white cane, it's very difficult to safely walk on the pavements. And I mean, Holly might experience the same things where you have, bumps and humps and holes and all of these cracks within the pavement. Some pavements, they're taken up by vendors, and so it's impossible to walk. And then when you are trying to traverse these areas, the vendors are upset if your cane touches their stand or, touches the product that they're selling. They're upset with you, but it's because they are taking up most of the space. And so you're left with a very narrow space to walk.
If any at all.
If any at all, right? You're left with a narrow space, and then just next to you is the roadway, and cars and vehicles are passing, and then you have a lot of, the drivers turning the roads into 4-lane roadways, and so you have to be very careful. And it is for that reason why I rarely traverse the roadways or the pavements, because of that same reason. And then sometimes your vehicle is unable to park close to the entrance because there's so many obstacles in the way, and you now have to leave your vehicle parked way up where, and then try to make your way to try and find the entrance to the building.
And it's even worse when you use a taxi and the driver is not helpful.
Right. And what you'll find is that vehicles tend to park wherever they please. Drivers tend to park wherever they please. And so they might be parked on the entrance, the bridge. So I'll think of Republic Bank, for example. You have cars parked in front there. They're designated places for them to be. And many of them would park and block the pathway. And so you are left with now having to try and squeeze to find a place to walk, or you have to try and jump over the trench to get onto the pavement if you want to access the bank. So, as Holly, her experience, they're quite similar to one that someone who's blind or visually impaired might experience, because of all the obstacles and barriers that are put in the place of someone walking.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Asif? Are your experiences the same like Rosemary and Holly to an extent?
Yes, Ganesh, definitely. I traverse the road almost on a daily basis, and everything that my colleagues would have mentioned, is the same. The parking issue, the open manholes, the vendors.
Do they still have open manholes?
A few, yes, they still do.
And we've had many blind persons falling into them and injuring themselves.
That's correct. That issue that, because of the whole parking, I would have experienced the driver dropping me off at the wrong building, right? Just because he didn't have parking, and because he didn't have the patience, and telling me that, this is my destination, right? So, these are issues that...
What about hitting people or walking into the vendors, their stands and things like that? Have you had experiences?
Definitely. Some of them, they are understanding, and some of them, the tolerance level, is not there. Yes, so definitely the same problems is, throughout across the board.
Mm-hmm. And what about internally? I know we have some large structures being erected, and one of the goals of most persons with disabilities is to be able to have independence, to be able to do things independently. Are you guys able to navigate in some of these large places, as for example a mall, or you always need assistance?
For me, Ganesh, personally, I think some of the buildings, not at all times, they are construct in a way that is fully accessible. At least I know definitely for wheelchair users, there's always the issue of the ramps. But also for someone who's blind, sometimes the stairway might not, the design of the pattern in terms of the design of the stairs and stuff like that could also be a bit confusing. Also, the internally with forest, so sometimes you could have, lots of the noise and stuff like that. So it could be a bit distraction and stuff like that. So yes, internally there is problems there also when you enter certain
Yeah.
buildings.
What about you, Rosemary? About internal navigation of some of the large buildings?
Yeah, you tend to have the same challenges, and I just want to point out that these issues that are being raised here, while they may seem to be individual problems, it's not as though we're saying or complaining that, oh, we can't get to do X or we can't get to do Y. The thing is that there are standards for designing buildings that ensure that these buildings are accessible. And it's something that you'll hear all the time, is that accessibility is for everyone or it benefits everyone, right? And so when buildings are constructed in a way where it doesn't accommodate persons with disabilities, you'll find that you are now excluding a section of what is possibly your market that you're serving, or the population that you're serving, right? So having all of these challenges, that I just wanted to say that, because I'm listening to Asif and I'm imagining people looking at this and saying that, oh, well, what do you want us to do then, right? You want us to cater to all your needs. And so I just wanted to raise that point that there are standards, there are international standards that ought to be enforced when erecting buildings and constructing these things.
Just to add to what
Yeah.
you're saying, Rosemary, is the Ghana National Bureau of Standards. They have a comprehensive list of standards that are in line with the universal design, but those are just there as guidelines, not to enforce compliance.
Right, and you'll always have these problems. If your building is not constructed in a way that is fully accessible, you'll always have these problems. You'll always have blind persons being unable to navigate within the building without assistance, right? Like sometimes, as Asif said, the staircase, has such a steep spiral design that you're coming down the step and you're not even aware that like there's a drop, right? Or there's a sharp turn. And so you're trying to follow the rail, but the rail may not be in the same way as the steps. So when you're following the rail, thinking that the rail is leading you, the steps might be designed differently. Some steps are very narrow. Some steps are extremely steep, right? So you might make a short step and then the second step is extremely high. So,
And that's what you
there's no
find, very narrow
consistency.
and steep
Yeah.
stairs.
And so there's no consistency. And then to be able to find washrooms and things like that, it's not accessible because maybe when they erected the building, the washrooms seem to be an afterthought. So it's a really narrow space. There's no
So,
real
yeah.
room and things like that for you to be able to be comfortable.
And that brings me to the point with Holly. What about navigating internally, Holly? Because Rosemary would have mentioned those narrow doorways, especially with the washrooms and so on. Let's say you're able to get into that building with a ramp. What about internal navigation?
That is still one of our biggest challenges. We've seen improvement. I've seen improvements in some of the, as you said, the malls, the two malls that we have on the coast. They are quite accessible. Even the washroom facilities are accessible for a wheelchair user. And I've seen Giftland has actually changed some of their layout to allow wheelchair users to easily go into the stores and come out of some of the stores that we had issues with before. So yes, we're seeing progress being made.
But it should be more
But
comprehensive.
yes, and it needs to
Right.
be. It should not be an afterthought. It should not be us complaining or us coming to you and say, "Hey, this is supposed to be happening." It's supposed to be when you're building with everyone in mind.
That's correct.
Because I was reading a piece yesterday, and it says that making a building accessible from the initial stages will cost you 1% more, but if you got a retrofit upon completion, it will cost you way more than that 1%.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you know what the thing is, to Ganesh, and this is extremely interesting to me, is that when accessibility features are put in place, guess who uses it most?
Persons without disabilities.
People
Persons
without
without disabilities.
disabilities.
Especially
Because
the
remember,
wheelchair
you
Because
have-
it's comfortable and it
Exactly.
accommodates everyone.
Yes.
I was in Movie Town and I always like to use accessible washrooms because it's extremely spacious, right? I couldn't go in because guess what? Someone was in there using it. And you'll always find people wanting to go into the accessible washroom because it's more spacious, right? Like you don't have to turn and then you hit the wall and things like that. Or
Yeah.
they might prefer using the ramp because it's generally more comfortable, you know, to
Yes.
access.
And as persons age,
Yeah.
they
Exactly,
they may
and
have
you have
knee
pregnant
problems.
mothers.
Yeah, exactly.
and so forth.
And the
but
ramp is convenient, so
and
it
even,
was not
with
only.
parents
Look at the elevators.
with
How
strollers.
many people opt to use the elevator over the
Yes,
steps, right?
That's so true.
Yeah.
Now, I quickly want to look at what are some of the measures that can be implemented by policymakers to ensure that Guyana becomes a more accessible place. You know, we're all speaking of development, we're all speaking of Guyana becoming the next Dubai, but we need to have a holistic approach to development, and it should be inclusive, and that is ensuring measures are in place to include persons with disabilities. So probably, Rosemary, you can highlight a few recommendations that policymakers can implement to make Guyana more accessible.
Sure, and I think talking about the enforcement of the Guyana PWD Act is the overarching guideline for policymakers and for different government agencies, because that is what really outlines in the different areas what ought to be done. And narrowing that down, you then have the building codes that we were talking about earlier, which comprehensively states what ought to be done when a building is being erected. And so if those things are enforced, then we would not have that problem. And finally, whenever recommendations or whenever these changes are being made, it has to be done in a systematic and a structured way.
And
Because
inclusive.
That, yes, that is the only way we will have sustainable change. And that's the only way we could have uniform change rather than one person doing one thing and then, you know, the other
because
one does something different and things like
You
that.
wouldn't have the need for Holly going about the place and having issues with everyone
With
because
10
of
different
accessibility.
buildings, right?
Yeah.
If the change is uniform across.
Because it needs to start with the approvals of building designs. It needs to start with the relevant authorities, and I think that has to do with the Central Housing and Planning Authority, and some of the NDCs and the town councils, to ensure that when building plans come on their desk, and these building plans are for public buildings or buildings for public access, and they do not have accessibility features, refuse them.
Yeah.
And that's where it needs to start.
Yeah.
Let's move on to employment. And I know we all would agree that the majority of persons with disabilities here in Guyana live in poverty. That's a fact. No one can run away from that. Many of them depend on the public assistance grant, which is provided by government, or they depend on the benevolence of their relatives, members of society, and so on for their survival. Few are employed. You guys are, in that category of the few who are fortunate to have some level of employment. We know what are the challenges when it comes to employment. We know that attitudes play a big role. People seeing persons with disabilities as not having ability to work. What measures can be instituted to ensure that more persons with disabilities are employed, both in the public and private sector? Because we do have people with disabilities that are skilled and qualified to work, but yet still not finding employment. What can be done? Starting with you, Asif.
Yeah, Ganesh, quickly. So one of the measures that could be implemented, government could consider to encourage employment, especially in the private sector, is tax exemptions and stuff like that. So you employ PWDs who have the necessary skills and who can work. You employ and you try to give those companies certain tax exemptions and stuff like that. Also for persons in the public sector, it's something that we have been calling for at least percentage of persons, quota of persons to once they're qualified and skilled to be employed, as a part of the public sector. I guess my colleagues can touch on a few other recommendations.
All right, that's it. Holian, what would be your recommendations to ensure that more persons with disabilities are employed?
We would love to see accessible public transportations for PWDs. We
Explain the correlation.
Accessible transportation means that those are vehicles that are fitted or outfitted to allow wheelchair users and other PWDs to safely transfer in and out of those vehicles. As a PWD or as a wheelchair user, we are not, we may not be able to financially support taking private taxis to work for 21 days or 22 days out of a month. So that's one of the reasons why it's a hindrance to employment for us, because we do not have transportation that can safely take us to and from our workplace. And having accessible vehicles would give us that independence that we need to be able to now go out and work in meaningful employment.
Mm-hmm. Rosemary, anything to add to Asif and Holian would have mentioned?
Yeah, I definitely second what Asif and Holly said. And I think there should be the continuation of what is currently being done, or at least what is hoped to be implemented, where you have the building centers, where you have the small business bureau giving grants to small business owners who have disabilities. All of those things are really, really good initiatives, and I can't talk about offering opportunities for employment without highlighting those things, because those initiatives have actually seen a lot of persons with disabilities have some form of employment, whether it's part-time or full-time, right? And so those are the initiatives that need to be sustained over time. And of course, as Asif said, having a quota system within the public sector so that qualified persons with disabilities are able to be employed. And as long as you have accessible transportation and accessible buildings, then I think that would greatly improve someone's chances of being employed, because now they're actually able to perform the job and they're not being hindered by anything.
I want to ask a question. I'm sure you guys do not have the statistics, but you can probably share some anecdotes. Are you aware of cases where persons with disabilities are actively seeking employment and being refused?
Yes, there are stories of that. And one of the things we always tell persons with disabilities is that you are not obligated to disclose your disability to a potential employer. And I think what happens is that when they show up for the interview, or once it is made clear that they have a disability, there's always the excuse of you were not hired for some other reason other than the fact that you have a disability. So I think that's where sensitization training needs to come in for these potential employers, so that they understand the nature of disabilities and how persons with disabilities can be reasonably accommodated within the workplace. Holly, do you have
Holly, yeah, because Holly. Go ahead, Asif.
So, and as Rose would have said, I think it should be mandatory for private sectors, for them to have continuous training when it comes to employing in terms of if there's an employee that has a disability in a company, for them to be training in terms of dealing with that person, and also continuous training in the sense of making their staff, aware in terms of part of customer representation, customer
service
yeah.
rep training.
Yeah.
Holly Ann, I know you would have acquired your disability in the not too distant past, so just a few years. Have you been actively seeking employment since acquiring your disability?
Yes, I have.
And if you can share just one or two experiences.
The responses I've gotten so far, it's not been the best in terms of, there are situations where I was overly qualified for positions, and the reason came back being, oh, there was someone who was, more qualified or had more experience than you, and it made you feel like probably, the main reason was because of my disability, that was the reason why I was not selected.
Wow. All right. I'm sure we can discuss this for another hour, but it's almost time for us to conclude. I want to ask you if you have any final thoughts or any message for persons, especially persons living with disabilities out there, and also the policymakers. Starting with you, Rosemary, in a few seconds.
Yeah, just to always remember that disability is a rights-based issue, and it's a human rights issue, and that's how we need to tackle the issues experienced by persons with disabilities.
Marianne?
To my fellow PWDs, as I think, see something, say something. That's the only way we can effect change.
Definitely. Asif?
Yeah, so first of all, in terms of the disability, happy International Disability Day. And of course, like my colleagues would have said, don't let the disability be a limitation to whatever it is that you want to do, despite of your disability, think positive.
Thank you very much for joining me and sharing in this discussion. To the public out there, I want to encourage you to ensure that you do whatever you can to help in the process of making Ghana a more accessible and inclusive place for all persons with disabilities. And to persons with disabilities out there, as Holly would have said, see something, do something. Don't just sit by and expect for it to be done for you. Be the difference or be the change you want to see. Thank you very much.